Great.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Uwe Brandes. I'm professor of practice and the faculty director of the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. It's really exciting to be here this morning for us here in Washington and afternoon for many of you in Qatar. And this is a kind of roundtable discussion, a workshop that is being conducted as part of a series of engagements this fall under the banner of the Urban Thinkers Campus. The Urban Thinkers Campus is a global program being advanced by the UN Habitat and the World Urban Campaign to explore important urban issues that need to be or should be elevated up to the awareness and of decision makers within the UN Habitat broader community. We're really excited to have organized a series around issues related to place management. And we see a tremendous amount of innovation occurring in cities around the world. And this series and today's conversation is an exploration of ideas being advanced and being practiced in Qatar. I would like to jump right into our program this morning. But before we do, I just want to thank Isabella Rosen, who has helped organize this today. And I would also like to thank Suan Choi, who's organized the panel and who will be moderating. So without further ado, Suan, please take it away.
Thank you, Uwe. Good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C. My name is Suan. I'm a master's student at Georgetown University studying urban and regional planning. I've also been working on a Global Cities Urban Thinkers Campus series this fall. Now, I had personally lived in Qatar for 3 years and seen both the glitz and glamour that Gulf cities are generally known for, but also seen the emerging local efforts to really try to identify what Qatar's urbanism means in its own unique context. So today, we're zooming into the utilization of arts, heritage, and culture, and how they play a role in shaping the identity of Qatar's new landscapes. And as well as how that creates a sense of place for diverse demographics that Qatar hosts. That includes from like migrant workers to Qatari nationals. And today we have 3 distinguished groups of panelists with us today. From the first group, Sebastien Turbot. Sebastien Turbot is the Director of Content Development at earthna, which is a nonprofit policy research and advocacy center within Qatar Foundation. Sebastien guides governments, cities, businesses, and civil societies in creating evidence-based policies and community-driven platforms that turn ideas into action. Sebastien is also a co-founder of Amaken. Isabella Rosen is a heritage program researcher at Qatar Museums and co-founder of the placemaking initiative Amaken as well. She's organizing an urban field lab, bringing together artists, students, and policymakers to research the market Souq al-Haraj in Doha. For our second group of panelists, we have Michael Perrone, who's assistant professor of paint and printmaking at Virginia Commonwealth University, Qatar. Recently, Perrone has completed 2 public art projects in Qatar, one at Doha Festival City and one at Lusail Crescent Park. Now we have Marco Bruno, who is also a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, teaching fine arts and design, and also a co-founder of MOTOElastico, which is a multidisciplinary space lab based in Seoul and Doha, working on architecture, interior, and public art projects. Lastly, we have Arshi. Arshi Ansari is a program coordinator at LIWAN Design Studios and Labs, which is a community-focused design institution in the heart of Doha. So welcome to all the panelists. We're really excited to hear your insights and experience and your work in the field, particularly in the place management and Qatar's context. So with that, I will hand it off to Sebastien and Isabella.
Thank you, Soon, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Let me maybe quickly start us off with an introduction to the Amaken movement. It's a new movement that was just that we just recently launched in Doha, focusing on placemaking here in Qatar. For those of you who may be less familiar with the concept of placemaking, we define placemaking about collectively reimagining and reinventing public spaces at the heart of their community. Next slide, please. And next again. Thank you. The Amaken network is part of a global movement around placemaking, Placemaking X, of which there is an Arab GCC subnetwork called Amaken, Amaken meaning space in Arabic. And we are the new little newborn of the Amaken network, being the Amaken Qatar chapter. And next slide, please. So we launched this movement here in Doha because we are kind of urban geeks in many shapes and forms who want to support communities here in creating vibrant places that really, truly stimulate social interaction, activities, and socioeconomic well-being. We want to do this in the kind of placemaking philosophy and vision of multi-stakeholder engagement process, so that to make sure that we're creating spaces for communities with communities. And of course, we don't want to just reinvent spaces for the sake of it and want to make sure that we pay particular attention to the physical, cultural, and social identities of the places we will be looking at here in Doha and here in Qatar. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, we've been kind of focus grouping with actors, urban leaders, and communities here in Doha, trying to identify what are the kind of the key challenges and needs. I won't go through all the list, but and back to Soon's point on kind of Gulf cities and the glitz and the glamour, we find that what people actually care about is mobility, walkability, isolation, the connection to nature, to diversity, to history, and kind of traditions. So this is all very recent, but this is probably what we're going to be looking at in the months to come. And on that, next slide, please. What's next for us? We're going to be testing, piloting, and showcasing placemaking interventions here in Doha. For example, we're working on a mobile gardens project. We'll seek to bring people together to convene actors here and facilitate policy discussions around space, because we're realizing that if you do want to intervene in the public space, you need to have policymakers on board. And we want to use the fact that Doha hosts many events, many of which focus on the urban landscape, to use these as opportunities to facilitate these discussions and to actually showcase placemaking interventions. And so if you're interested, we're going to be at the AIPH Green City event at Expo in February, at the Tasmim event in March, and my organization, earthna, will be leading an Arid Cities event in May. And in all of these events, and probably more to come, as I said, we're going to be trying to test and pilot actual physical interventions in these event spaces. But these event spaces allow us to have a safe space to be able to test and pilot things. After this quick introduction, I'll pass it on to my friend and colleague Isabella for her to introduce our urban field project at Souq Al Haraj.
Thank you, Sebastien. So yes, this spring I organized the first urban field lab in Souq Al Haraj in Al Najma, together with the QPS vocational school director Thomas Modine. And the urban field lab focused on documenting and representing secondhand goods and building materials market Souq Al Haraj in the neighborhood Al Najma. As you can see on the next slide, Al Najma belongs to the traditional core of Doha. It's a neighborhood that's densely populated and mainly has low-rise buildings, and the population is highly male dominant and mainly low-income migrant workers from India, Pakistan, and Nepal who live in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So the dominant land use is residential and commercial, and at the heart of the commercial activities in Al Najma is Souq Al Haraj. It's a very vibrant space. It is a space where secondhand goods are repaired and recycled, and furniture and building materials are traded. it has an economic and a social significance for the migrant community. And next slide, please. However, throughout the years, there have been multiple proposals to demolish it and to replace it by commercial redevelopment, such as you can see on the right hand. And these plans never materialized, but they did make me think, what if Souq Haraj would be redeveloped? Could it be done in a manner that's more respective to its current qualities and function for the neighborhood? The next slide, please. So here you see some impressions from the Souq as it is currently. Also on the following 2-3 slides, there are some impressions. And so with the urban lab, we aimed to capture the current character of the Souq. And so we brought together participants from various backgrounds and investigated the spatial and the social fabric of the market. And every team of participants chose a different perspective as well as method of representation. So we had graphic designers who made a swatch book with the characteristic colors of the Souq, a visual artist who made a collage of objects and took many pictures and put them together in a reportage. There was an urban planner and a sociologist who mapped the prayer spaces that would unfold during, or that do unfold during the day. An anthropologist who visualized the life cycle of an upcycled object in the Souq, a bed that was repeatedly purchased, used and disposed throughout decades and always found its way back to the Souq. So from the visual identity to the functionality of its spaces to a single object that has been sold and resold throughout the decades, the Urban Field Lab uncovered these special characteristics and the economic and social significance the space has. The next slide, please. So with underlying the question, can we imagine alternative models of urban redevelopment that are more interweaving local traditions and heritage instead of erasing and rebuilding? The following. These are some impressions from the field lab, and the last slide shows our closing session, during which the participants presented their projects, and we had a panel of experts reflecting on them and also on what the Souq could mean in their opinion. And we drew some interesting conclusions, one of which is that we should expand the notion of heritage in Doha in the space, such as Souq Haraj, which may not have the outstanding aesthetic quality, still has a heritage value because of its economic, symbolic, and social value. And so planning authorities should be aware of the narrative that is connected to the place and how the local communities are using the space. And with this input and this research, we're planning a second urban field lab that will use that to build on it and work with different communities on designing small interventions in the space that can improve the quality of the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella and Sebastian. We want to ask questions, but we are running short on time, so we're going to jump right into the second case study, but we'll go back to this presentation and entertain some conversations about, who may be the stakeholders and this emerging sort of practice of placemaking in Qatar, and what does the future of placemaking look like in Qatar as we're moving forward, with intentionally trying to place placemaking initiatives and practices at the forefront of urban planning in Doha. So the second case study, I believe, is with Arshi, LIWAN Design and Studios. So with that, Arshi, I will hand you the floor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arshi, and I'm a programs coordinator at LIWAN Design Studios and Labs. And I'm here to present LIWAN as a case study, on cultural and historic place management within Qatar. LIWAN is a unique adaptive reuse project based out of the site of Qatar's first school for girls, as well as possibly the first formal school building in Qatar. From what we know about the building through oral history records is that it was built in the 1950s, and it was operational as a primary school for girls until 2005, even though the school held classes till 2009. Next slide, please. The building is situated in Musharraf, which is a part of the city that was yet emerging as a district during the 50s. It is today noted as a heritage quarter in the city. During the rapid urban development of Qatar between the 70s and the 90s, the area was notable for hosting a large expatriate community. By 2010, when the surrounding areas were cleared to make way for the Musharraf Downtown Regeneration Project, this building survived and was used to store artifacts and memorabilia related to the Musharraf area for many years. You can see some of the signboards that were brought, signboards and gates from old houses that were brought into the school. It was briefly resurrected as an art center by Musharraf Properties, which is the same developer that was doing the Musharraf Downtown project. However, the project didn't continue for very long. Aishal Suwaidi, who's the director of LIWAN, scoped out the place for the current Qatar Museums project in early 2019. In 2019, LIWAN was conceptualized as a project aimed at creatives and designers and designated as a creative hub under Qatar Museums. LIWAN, which references the beautiful inner courtyards of the property, which I will show you later, has been redeveloped into a space for designers and creatives in Doha. Today, it functions both as a co-working space for over 30 individual creatives and office spaces for 6 next-generation design projects. The classrooms of the old school, as pictured, have been reinterpreted to studio spaces and meeting rooms. Next slide, please. The project is currently managed and funded by Qatar Museums, which is a state entity that manages all museums in the country under the Ministry of Culture. And the site is under governmental jurisdiction and ownership. While previously the building was allocated some funds by Musharraf Properties to operate as an art center, it remained without any major changes until 2020. In 2020, the project site was put under redevelopment. The project was managed by the PMO office, the Project Management Office in Qatar Museums, which is the engineering office. And the renovation was undertaken by Ashghal, which is the Public Works Authority in Qatar. The end user in this case was LIWAN, represented by the director Aishal Suwaidi. Next slide, please. In totality, the restoration of the building spanned 3 major activities, the first one of which was curation and conservation of objects already present on site. This took place in 2019 as a curatorial project on the history of the site. I was involved with the project as an intern, and we worked with Hadil Al-Tayyib, who is a curator who specializes in oral history projects. After recording oral histories from community members, we did multiple walkarounds of the school to pick out objects that we felt would provide context to space in the future. And then we took actions to preserve them. A good example is on the bottom left, you can see a picture of old children's school books as well as folk tales. And what we did with this is that we kept every single one of the 3,000 plus books that we found and converted into a design reference library. Next slide, please. The second activity that we undertook was repair and further curation of spaces. A year-long redevelopment from 2020 to 2021. It was a laborious process of, first of all, bringing the building up to code. Second, making essential repairs, while also managing the design process with the intention of changing how the building was being used. Essentially, we couldn't keep it as classrooms when no classes would be held there. So this phase was us finding the answer to the question of how to curate the spaces, maintain the connection of the building to its history, while also make sure we can get our use out of the building. Aishal Suwaidi, who's a furniture designer herself, worked with Laura Murane, an interior designer, to create a concept for the space that was rooted in, as you can see, mid-century influences relevant to the age of the building. Next slide, please. The third activity, this is the library that was redone. I'm not sure if it's obvious from the picture, but this is exactly how the library was laid out. So we just changed the entire layout of the library and made sure to use furniture that calls back to the time of the age of the building. Next slide, please. The third activity that we undertook was the cultivation of community. The area that the school was located in was emptied out over the past 2 decades, partially because of the Musharraf regeneration project, which was a lot of construction was going on in the space, but also very recently because of Public Works Authority taking over the space to make essential repairs to the infrastructure of the city. What this meant was that streets around the building were emptied out. Buildings that used to exist around the school were also emptied out and vacated. No teachers or students had been on site since 2010. A large part of the initial work that we did on this project was just tracking down the founding members of the community at LIWAN, who as an older group were very hard to reach and connect with. Still, we found WhatsApp groups, we found groups of siblings who had taught at the school as well as attended the school together and more. While this helped us reach out to the original community, the next challenge was how to turn LIWAN and the school building into a space for a new community that was in many ways an opposing demographic to the original occupants. We were looking for a much younger group of designers and creatives to use the building. And so LIWAN's programs then had to develop a strategy to attract and house these creatives. LIWAN is now a design institution with over 30 members for its co-working spaces and 10 residents. We host workshops, small exhibitions, talks, and community events that attract hundreds of creatives. The community of alumni and teachers of the old school are still an important part of our community outreach efforts, and the building is open to them. In fact, a specific visitor center is currently being developed to accommodate their presence on site. Next slide, please. LIWAN is an early and hopefully not one of the only examples of adaptive reuse in the country. And what the project has tried to do is rejuvenate and extend the original community of the building while also reorganizing itself as a new space for a new community. As with many adaptive reuse projects, it is also a candidate for heritage conservation efforts, and older parts of the building preserve early methods of construction and experimentation by local builders from some of the earliest states of development in Qatar. LIWAN is a vision of the space that takes into account the history of the building and in some ways continues the legacy of pedagogy. It does not displace or rudely interrupt the history of the site. With this project, it articulates the argument that subjects of adaptive reuse projects don't have to be limited in how they are reimagined. They just have to be considerate of the history and the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Arshi. I think that was a good segue from Isabel and Sebastian's conversation about how do we reimagine instead of destroying and rebuilding everything, repurposing a historical heritage site and connecting that with community. And I really was, I really found it intriguing that LIWAN specifically tried to integrate sort of former school alumni and students to really do this work together, but as well as working with multiple stakeholders in Doha. Again, in the interest of time, we're going to just jump straight onto the next presentation by Michael and Marco on the cricket shelters.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice presentation before. I think I will start the presentation and then Michael probably will make some comment if he has any in the end. So we are, both me and Michael, we are working in VCU. In Virginia Commonwealth University, but we also practice independently, me as an architect, as a designer, and as a public space kind of designer, and Michael as an artist. So this is a nice project because it's a combination of these two interests that we have, both for public space and for public art. So, and this project was able to put the two things together. You can go to the next slide. So what is very interesting, this project is about cricket. And if you have been in Doha, you know very well that cricket is the very popular sport. Actually, cricket is the second most practiced sport in the world after football. And if you just go around during the weekend on Friday, especially Friday morning, you start to see a lot of people playing in any possible empty lot that they find around the city. So it could be a parking lot, could be a dirt patch, could be anywhere they can play. And if you open a Google map and you zoom in, you start to see how these people, they do placemaking. Actually, they are way more advanced than us in thinking about how to secure a place and secure a location. So all these signs that you see, the cricket ground, the Lions ground, the Royal Trivians, are all names of teams that they go on Google and they secure a location so that they go and play during the weekend, and they are sure that they can invite their friends and the other teams to play in that specific location. This is actually in front of my house, and I live in a compound called Almesilla, and I just go out on a Friday morning and I see 500 people playing in that parking lot that was built for the World Cup. So it's very popular, and we started to think, what can we do with that? I think it's already interesting on its own. So we started to investigate the community and started to try to get to know a little bit better. It took a while to understand how to get in touch with them. We started to contact people at QF. We started to contact the staff that works in our school. Everybody plays cricket from the South Asian community, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. It's very, very popular. And what we started to learn is that it's not really a divider, this sport. Actually, is the opposite, a unifier. And it's really cutting across a different level of the society. It's not only the worker that has a Friday morning free that plays in the patch that you have in front of us, but there are also people working at Hamad Hospital, working in other big institutions in the city. And it's really a way to gather the community and put together people in a very playful way. So you can go to the next one. Actually, I don't know very well the order of the slide, but yeah. So we started to go to them and to propose something that we thought it was missing. If you go in the street, and we were there we were early last year, so July and August, at 7 a.m. in the morning, there are already more than 40 degrees. So it's they usually meet at 5:30, these people. They start to play at 5:30 in the morning and they finish by 9. The people that go to the mosque, they go to the mosque. The other one, they just go home. But anyway, the conditions are really harsh. It's really difficult. So what we propose is to build some shelters, some areas that could be used as a shade to provide shelter for these people, but at the same time that could put cricket into the map somehow. So to elevate their, let's say, psychological condition or appreciation from the rest of society that usually is looking down at these people and not really considering them as practicing a sport or something like that. So we propose these two shelters. As you can see, it's a combination of form and color. So I work on the form, Michael work on the colors, and we try to develop different shapes that were modular, and that could be always change, assemble in a different way, or reimagine every time they had to be placed in a different position. You can go to the next one. So we proposed several locations to Qatar Museum, and actually the one in front of my house in Almesilla was the one that we like the most because it's just people that are going there to play. So on a Friday and on a Saturday afternoon, and they don't have anything. There is really nothing. There is just a parking lot and some patches. So we wanted to do it over there. We started to negotiate with Qatar Museum. The Qatar Museum liked the idea. They wanted to support it. But in reality, it was impossible to find permission for the land because that land belongs to someone, but then it's hard to get permission from this someone to allow a temporary construction on it. So we ended up working with the Lusail Cricket Ground, which is a more formalized cricket association that has 15 pitches, I think, that are going out for rent. And they have a minimum infrastructure. They are well kept. They are a circle surrounded by very small bricks that are just basically telling you which one is the area where you have to play. and with the runway, with the pitch made out of concrete into the middle of the area. So here is me persuading the people in Lusail Association, Michael setting the piece on the ground and trying to see if it's fitting or not. And so this is how we started to discuss with them. Next. These spaces are inspired by this kind of construction that are also another very big landmark in Doha. These are the shelters that are mandatory for construction company during work on streets or in open area. So they are very basic shelters. They are already a shelter, so they offer kind of water, benches, spaces to sit, and just it's just a small space where to take a rest. They are usually very, I cannot say well designed, but there is a lot of design into these spaces, and it's done with very simple elements. So scaffolding, benches that are done with leftover from construction, and we find them inspiring and very interesting, and we wanted to celebrate that with our piece. So next. So we started to design pieces that are made with a modular metal structure. And the photo on the right is during the construction that was done in the industrial area by a company that makes shades for parking. And we wanted to use a scaffolding, but then was very difficult to solve all the issue of safety. Scaffolding has a lot of points and spikes that are dangerous, that would be difficult to be approved as a public space. So we ended up using metal profile, but with the same idea. And so we tested it during the construction, and then we reassemble it in the site. And is there, the photo that you see over there is in the site. Next. And this is the final piece. I mean, for the sake of this presentation, this is kind of short, but with Michael, we started to talk about how to paint this. Michael made several experiments, but then the winning idea was to try to blend in, to do this kind of atmospheric painting, where the color is kind of blending into the atmosphere and into the background. So maybe Michael, you can add something if you feel like, or.
Yeah, I think it was just one of our solutions that was inspired by the Doha sunset and sunrise, and that became just kind of a conceptual framework for thinking about this gradation of color.
Yeah, and also because the time that when these shelters are used is sunset and sunrise most of the time. So they never play in the middle of the day, but they play at the beginning and at the end of the day. So these are images of the final pieces that are there in the Lusail ground. As you can see, they have a few benches inside. They have a covered area on the outdoor all around, and they provide not only a kind of a physical kind of refuge or shelter for these people, but also a kind of a psychological identity. So they really become kind of a symbol, or like I can say a monument, a very modest monument for this community, and they're very much used. This is during a normal day. So they get surrounded in a very informal way by cars. You can go next. People play. They use it to watch the game. So it means that they sit on the bench and they put their stuff inside, and they use it as a gathering space. And they just watch what is happening. As cricket is a very long game. It can last 5 days in the total, but they just play for a couple of hours. And next. And this is how you see it during the night. So when nobody is there during a normal day during the week, most of the time these are deserted and they blend into the landscape of Doha. Thank you. Sorry, no, sorry, I forgot one thing. I said thank you. This was, of course, it's a project supported by Qatar Museum, and we are very happy that this was the first project that was done under this initiative, which is called Annual Intervention. And actually, the Annual Intervention was modeled upon our proposal. So we went to Qatar Museum without knowing anything. We just started to talk to the curators in the public art department. And little by little, we work together. So we shape the proposal, but Qatar Museum shaped the call based on our proposal. And we are very happy that then the following year, they are using our structure as a way to advertise the proposal. And two of our students are currently discussing the possibility of making the next project, which would be a very nice way to pass the work to the next generation. So, and this is really the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Michael. Well, the second last slide, I think, with the shelter in the parking lot, it almost looks like a monument in a desert. And it really does make a difference that that shelter is there. And the design is just beautiful. So congratulations on your work. And it was really, you know, insightful to hear, you know, how you try to make a place identity for people who are often not given a separate space dedicated for themselves. With that, we will bring everyone together, all the panelists together, and have some Q&A. So the audience who are here, if you have any questions, please feel free to put in a chat. But I have questions myself that I've prepared. And the large themes that I want to go over are sort of stakeholders, sort of public-private partnerships. It's, you know, it's not a hidden fact that the Qatari state, whether that's through Qatar museums or the government, like, or the ministry, funds a lot of these projects, right? So I want to talk a little bit about public-private partnerships. And Isabella, you mentioned a little bit about, you know, working with non-traditional stakeholders like sociologists, anthropologists. So let's talk a little bit about that. And that covers a little bit of the finance part of it. And the second one I want to talk about is the place identity. What does place identity mean in Doha, and how is Doha and in the post-World Cup context trying to identify and rebrand itself? And the third one, if we have time, I think it's an important conversation, and Marco touched a little bit about this, climate change, which is going to affect Gulf cities, including Doha, and how does public space play a role in mitigate or adapting to climate change and increasingly hotter and hotter climate in Doha. So with that, let's go into the question about stakeholders. And I'm going to leave the floor open to everyone in case you want to jump in. Any panelists can pick up the question first. The first question is, who are the main players, the key stakeholders of planning and managing places in Qatar? And what is usually the role of the government in this? Anyone?
I mean, if you want,
Yes,
I'll go first.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that with our project, I think the unique quality in regard to the question is that it's activating a totally unique population and creating a space that is both serving a purpose as a shelter for the cricket players, but also as a potential of destination just to see the pieces, see the artwork. So it's a dual place, and it can be a place for people interested in art. It can be a place for people interested in sport, and it's activating this place that otherwise many people would not visit if they're not interested in cricket.
I would like to ask, actually, Michael or Marco, how did the cricket players respond initially when you came to them with your ideas and proposals?
Yeah, it was an interesting process that Marco alluded to a little bit. It started with Marco and I reaching out to colleagues here at VCU that we knew were engaged with the cricket community. And then it became kind of, oh, I have a friend. And then we would meet the friend, and then we'd have a interesting conversation, drawing diagrams, trying to explain the concept, us trying to understand cricket, which neither of us were that familiar with. So it was a really interesting back and forth that I think helped us in the development of the project. And then ultimately we came in contact with the gentleman in the photo when we're on site at their field. And it was really interesting. We wound up sponsoring the team and getting shirts for them. And there was a nice back and forth on WhatsApp where we're checking in and working on designs for the cricket shirts. So it really, it did have its moments of expanding beyond the project and connecting us with a community that we wouldn't have normally connected with.
Awesome. Sebastien, did you have anything to say about the question?
Well, just very quickly to say that, it's a question of, well, who uses the space, who owns it, and who kind of oversees it, regulates it. From that perspective, in a way, Doha is not very different to any other kind of city. You'll have a place used by citizens, owned by a private developer, but kind of overseen and regulated by the government or policymakers. I guess here there's kind of two ways. There's a glass half empty, glass half full way of looking at it. The glass half empty is that Doha is still a relatively kind of small city, so it's actually, as compared to other cities where I've done placemaking, it's actually not that hard to identify the right people and to actually meet with them. That's kind of easier than in other places I found. But the difficult part is onboarding them, kind of engaging them in this kind of placemaking approach of, letting go and letting communities, users kind of own the space and letting people try and test stuff. This is where there's still a cultural shift to happen around this idea of testing and activating and letting people try stuff in public spaces.
Awesome. I think that's actually a good segue to Uva's question in the chat, where, it's about sort of how the popular conception of placemaking is sort of it happens spontaneously. But in all of the case studies that we've seen, I think there was a lot of research, a lot of intentionality built into each project. So would you agree that the practices are, moving just from the placemaking domain of things to really managing places, to place management? And maybe this goes back to the question around, like, what is the future of managing places in Doha, given that these practices, are evolving?
I think particularly in the context of LIWAN, considering it is government-owned land, the way the project developed is an interesting way to think of even future projects developing, where when LIWAN started, it was an idea for a design institution. No one knew that it was going to be in this particular school building, but the idea was to look for a space that could really anchor a community. And obviously, when you're starting a new initiative, the first thing is you look for a place where this initiative can be housed. And it's really other museums' vision that they looked at buildings that already existed, that weren't being used, that were in areas. And as many of you who are familiar with this area in Doha, was that this was a completely vacant area. There was nothing else in the area. So it was really their vision that they looked at a building in such a region and decided to allot it for a community space.
Great. I kind of want to shift the conversation to the notion of place identity in Doha, especially in the context of post-2022 World Cup. And there was a lot of conversations today about connecting with the community, providing spaces for the community. So, I think it's debunking sort of the popular misconception that, Doha only builds places for expats or tourists. And I wonder what has been sort of the emerging conversations in Qatar about branding Doha's unique urban identity, and how is that changing in the post-World Cup context, and who are we catering?
I don't know, maybe I can try. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
We keep having good timing. I'll just say quickly that I think in our project, Marco and my project, and other projects that I've done, my previous public art piece was painting a basketball court in a Lusail City Park. And so I think there is an effort through Qatar museums, through programs that they have called like Jadari art, which is a street art, graffiti art, to bring art out of the museums and into the community, not just for the typical museum goer, but more so for the everyday public. Another piece that I have is a mural that's painted on the highway under an overpass that's commonly seen just by people driving by. So again, this idea of the expanded museum, I think, is an interesting concept.
I was going to say it's maybe more of an urban planning answer to your question than the placemaker one specifically, but post World Cup, the feeling I'm getting, and also some of my work at earthna, is maybe a move away from the kind of more like smart city aspects of urban planning, you know, of smart cities being kind of the silver bullet to quote unquote modern city building, and more of a focus on how we can look at heritage, traditions, culture, and use that as inspiration for urban planning and city making. I mean, the pre-World Cup example is kind of Mushere, very smart, but also inspired by more traditional techniques of city building. But my understanding is that we're going to be looking more and more at these types of aspects of traditional practices and when looking at how we design and think spaces.
Following up on that, I think adaptive reuse is an increasingly important strategy in urban development. So the LIWAN project, in that sense, is a good inspiration and a good set the ground in a way that I think many projects will follow in that manner, trying to really reuse existing buildings rather than building from scratch. And that also connects again to the issue of sustainability in a way.
Yeah, that's, oh, sorry, Archie, go ahead.
I was just saying that with LIWAN, it's entirely targeted at the local community. And it's not even that it's about creating pieces for the museum where you can have tourists go in and explore work made by Qatari artists. It's a space that's entirely meant for people living within Qatar to work within Qatar. It's entirely community focused. That's the only reason for its existence, in a way, that it's providing a space to the existing community in Qatar.
Yeah, and I think it's a really dynamic practice, because I think the word community is very generic, right? But in Doha's context, from my experience, that community, depending on the context, changes all the time. So it's really, I think, thinking about long term, how do you cater to different kinds of people who may use a space. And Sebastien, I really liked your sort of insight on moving from smart city to looking at heritage and culture. Because I think when we were thinking about World Cup, Qatar's urban planning, you think about the metro that's just built from scratch, and these mega infrastructure projects. But today's discussion, I think we really zoomed into sort of more, introspective practices of urban planning that Qatar is trying to embrace. So that was really interesting to hear. The next question is about climate change, and I am particularly inspired by Marco and Michael's project on cricket shelters, and I wonder, what is the intersection between adapting to climate change and creating public spaces in Qatar, whether that's outdoors or indoors. And yeah, it's sometimes it's an insufferably hot place. If anyone's been there in the summer, it's almost unlivable sometimes. But how does urban planning and placemaking respond to sort of the emerging threats of climate change? That could pose an existential threat to Doha's urban landscape.
On this one, I'll jump in with both my Amaken hat, but also my earthna hat. Being a think tank on sustainability and specifically sustainability in hot and arid environments, and even more specifically on cities. I think the first thing to say is that we see placemaking as intrinsically linked to both the climate change conversation and the well-being conversation, in the sense that it's only if we build places for people and for their well-being but they can also be adapted to climate change. It's a question around shading. It's a question around air quality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to build spaces that are good for people and good quote unquote for the planet. And where I'm seeing a shift is that Doha, like many cities in the world, like hot and cold, you usually build for the worst period of the year. You build for when it's -30 or +50 degrees. I think what's interesting and what's happening now, and I believe we're going to see it more and more, is building for the best period of the year. So a place where you can actually be outside with some shading, so you're enjoying the city, but you're also protecting your body from the heat. You're greening the city, and so you're building its resilience, and people enjoy the greenery. So once again, it's really this link between climate change and well-being that for me is a nexus that we need to insist on.
I just wanted to add.
Yeah, but just say the cricket example is a perfect example. I mean, they could literally. I mean, you can literally die of the heat here. So if cricket players are not protected, it would affect their well-being. Go ahead, Archie. Sorry.
I just wanted to add that it's not just about coming up with new ways of dealing with the heat. It's also about looking back to what already existed, what was already in the language of architecture within Qatar before the spate of development that the 70s and the 80s saw. So with LIWAN, it's an indoor-outdoor space. When we came in, we actually had to install ECs because it's intolerable in the summers now. It didn't always used to be. And even then, the building itself has a lot of climatic adaptations that makes the courtyards and places like that more tolerable in the summer. So it's just about really looking back at what these buildings used to be and how they themselves can be reimagined to accommodate climate change.
Yeah, if I can jump in from a personal point of view, I don't think our shelter are an answer to the climate change in terms of practical, like quantity and kind of dimensions, but I think they are more of a symbolic answer to it. And I think that's what we can work on, honestly, because the tackling climate change is really like a political kind of a move that comes from a government somehow, or comes from a way bigger group of decision maker than we are. But of course, we can stimulate that. And I think one of the reasons of doing that project was really to bring up issues and communities that are not normally considered for that kind of, they are not considered for an art project, for a lot of things that are happening. So I think the idea of creating these small monument that are kind of celebrating their resilience somehow, the fact that you go out in August at 6 a.m. to play and they do it. So it's simply that we are not used to do it, but they do. And I think that's something that should be celebrated. Mm-hmm. If I can go back to the first question that you asked, private and public partnership, I think that's the key kind of issue here, because at the moment, everything is coming from Qatar Museum, I mean, from our point of view. So I'm sure Qatar Museum would be very happy to delegate sometime to other people or to other investors, or to other entities, the development of project of such an importance. So it would be great if it's possible to develop a system that can encourage other entity to jump into the conversation, that is not only like a major institution like Qatar Museum that we always have. When I have an idea, I have to go to Qatar Museum. I don't have anyone else to go. So, and unfortunately, I feel a little bit also limited on my side that I have only one person I can talk to. but to involve other stakeholders, that would be great. And really, I think this is the next step for Qatar, and it would be really to involve a bigger amount of potential client rather than users that can commission interesting work and can make a difference in the public scene. Wow.
Yeah, well, I think all of your works are paving the path to diversifying stakeholders, and potentially also getting, more stakeholders to be involved in thinking about how to adapt urban spaces for climate change, to the impacts of climate change. I do want to entertain one last question in the chat before we wrap up, and we might need to make this brief, but I do want to ask this question to the panelists. I'll just read it out loud. Each of these case studies involved the celebration and development of existing uses and activities. Each elevates these existing activities. Is there an explicit goal of achieving deeper secondary and tertiary social impact, and what might these deeper impacts be?
I think to briefly speak about Amaken, one of the impacts we would hope to achieve is that more and more diverse communities are, in a way, and that's the project Michael and Marco have realized, to involve more people in shaping their urban environment and having a say and a connection and a sense of ownership over their urban environment. And I think that's what we hope with the platform and with Amaken to work towards.
Yeah, I agree that the sense of ownership is one of the key element here, and it's really like a keyword. It's very difficult in a society where a lot of people are temporary somehow to establish this sense of ownership, because it's a sense of ownership maybe that is limited to a certain amount of time. But these are conditions that are also stimulating and unique in this environment, and would be interesting to find a way to work with that and really try to put it at the center of the projects, of the next projects that will be developed or planned by big institutions. So I think that's ownership. It's really a key, because it's something that can guarantee a longer life for project, a longer kind of attachment from people. So.
I think there's also the overall strategy of reactivating community centers that could have been if a significant remodeling of city centers was not required, which it absolutely was. At the same time, once these areas have been emptied out, it needs to be a very intentional restructuring of the communities back there. There needs to be a way to, or a plan created to bring people who used to be in the area back and to engage them with these areas once again, because these areas are familiar to them. So in a way, I think that's what LIWAN also addressed, maybe to a smaller extent than many other projects that are coming up. Yeah.
Great. Well, if anyone has, if any of the panelists want to share any last few words, this is the time. Otherwise, we will wrap it up. Anyone has a few words to say to wrap up?
I'll just say on our end, for Isabella and I, we've initiated this Amaken movement here in Doha. It's very new. We're barely starting, but the more the merrier. So we really encourage anyone here and see this video later that if you want to join us and participate and help us, please join.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this initiative to lead the placemaking movement in Doha, and hopefully, you know, that also, like Marco said, you know, it may not be the public sector, but it might be able to serve as a catalyst for the public sector to really place management, placemaking at the centerpiece of thinking about Doha's urban development. So with that, we will come to a closing. Uva, I will give you the opportunity to say a few words before we leave, but I thank all the panelists for sharing your work and the wonderful sort of the field work and experience that you've brought to our conversation. And, you know, I personally spent time in Qatar, but I think I learned a huge deal myself about what the future and the evolving practices of place management in Qatar is looking like. And hopefully Qatar's example serve as an inspiration for the wider Gulf region and the Middle East. And it's really exciting to see how unique models of Qatar's urban planning, you know, gets applied, not just in Doha's context, but hopefully, you know, it's an inspiration for the wider region. Okay, Uva, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Suin. I just wanted to thank all of the speakers. We're so grateful for you sharing your work. I'm also especially struck by the intentionality and the research and the deliberate intent behind each of these projects. It is truly inspiring. The purpose of this whole series is to explore how these practices are changing in cities, and you've given us a lot to be inspired by. I'd like to thank everyone, and especially Isabella, for your collaboration, and we look forward to being in touch as we collectively elevate these practices in the context of the UN Habitat. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
1 minute.